everyone! Welcome to our second online module. The goals of this module are to continue our discussion on pragmatics from last week by talking about two readings that are on the course site. If you'd like to open the PDFs and look at them, the first one is a research project where the researchers were interested in examining the speech active apologies with EFL learners. The other is a practitioner article that was written to help us understand how to apply these concepts to working with language learners, so it's a pedagogically oriented piece. And our other goals are for me to help you get more ideas about what you'd like to do for your final projects, to come up with a rough idea, share it, and to help you each polish that idea to have a research project that you're interested in and comfortable with for your final project in the course. And lastly, I want to give you some examples of complements and help you think about ways you can collect complements in the different contexts you're involved in everyday life, whether it's online, offline, professional, at home, or wherever. So let's start by talking about the first article. As I mentioned, it's a research piece, and the researchers were interested, I believe they're sisters actually, they were interested in using a discourse completion task, which is a kind of questionnaire. In this case, it has 10 items. If you're interested, it's in the appendix at the back of the article. And this is a way to collect data from a large number of participants, usually in a short period of time. So people use it because it's convenient and it gives you interesting information about a speech act. But I'll talk in a few minutes about the pros and cons of this type of data versus elicited data versus the more natural or authentic data. And the gap that they were trying to address is that there were few studies on apology strategies by Arabic speakers. So of course there's always got to be some way to situate the study in the literature and the previous findings of other studies. And they were interested in the variable of sex, comparing male and female students to see what commonalities and what differences they had in their apology strategies. So, several researchers have come up with lists of strategies, things that we do when we apologize. This is actually not just one speech act, it's kind of a collection of them. It's very complex when we apologize. So Brown and Ottardo in 2000 have one of these lists compiled for us. It includes things like expressing an apology, of course, where the wrongdoer vocalizes the feelings of regret, an explanation of the situation where the wrongdoer tries to reconstruct the incident, acknowledgement of responsibility, where he or she would claim responsibility for what happened, an offer of repair, trying to present a way to undo the harm, a promise of non-recurrence, where you promise not to repeat the offense. Okay? If you're curious, as I was, about whether or not this has been explored with Egyptians, if you have the article handy and you look at page 1909, you can see a reference to a study with Egyptians, and these researchers wanted to compare how Egyptians apologize versus how Americans apologize. So they did make that comparison, and if you don't have the article, I'll just read to you a couple of interesting points about the differences they found. Of course, they found many similarities, but two of the key differences that occurred with the Egyptians but not with the Americans were these strategies. The first was Egyptians tend to attack the offended when the offender thinks the offended cannot justify his or her position. And there's an example, an incident where a headmaster blames a janitor he bumped into for the incident instead of apologizing to him. So whether or not you think this is a real occurrence or something you've noticed when people apologize here, I think that would be interesting for us to talk about in our next face-to-face session. The other strategy I mentioned that was unique to the Egyptians and they didn't find with the Americans was Egyptians praise Allah, God, for everything that happens, whether good or bad, as part of this collection of speech acts to apologize. So those are some interesting things we could discuss. And there are other strategies, as I said, other lists from different researchers when looking at these groups. So the key findings of the study are that the most common strategy across males and females is the statement of remorse, which is just to simply say sorry or excuse me, forgive me, that sort of thing, to apologize. And the females, one of the differences in terms of males versus females is that the females tended to assign more responsibility to themselves or others. And also another difference based on sex is that only the males invoked Allah's name. So these are some of the key findings of this particular study on apologies. Now, as I mentioned, the other reading was the article on raising the pragmatic awareness of language learners. And this was in the context of working with Iranian ESL students, so Persian is their L1. And the researcher wanted to compare how they apologize and how they can find different types of apologies in their environment with the speakers of the target language, in this case American English speakers. So, what this researcher did is use the DCT type of instrument for the students to collect their own data. So they're sort of acting as researchers. One thing that she did is she gave them these prompts where they filled it out. So they were the participants in a sense for the first phase, and asked them to please write in the provided spaces whatever you would say in the following conversational situations. So the prompt is, you forget a meeting with a friend. This is the second time that the same thing has happened with the same person. At the end of the day, your friend phones you and says, I waited for more than 20 minutes, what happened? And they have to imagine they're in this scenario and write what they think they would say, which is what you would do with your own research participants if you wanted to collect a particular speech act. And these are some of the sample responses. So the Persian responses included a lot of formulaic language and typical kinds of strategies that would be used. So things like, oh my gosh, mister, we became ashamed again. To your soul, I don't know at all why. It happened, mister, I'm ashamed. The pressure of life has not left any attention for me. Or simply saying, I forgot. So you can see even within a particular group, there's going to be a range and different strategies used, but then you'll be able to find some patterns of things that are more typical and high frequency. And so comparing one of the examples from American English, the respondent said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot. Can we schedule another time to meet? So a similarity in terms of expressing remorse or the apology, but then offering this strategy of a proposed solution for the future in a way, the future appointment being scheduled. And in terms of having the students collect authentic data, so this is a little different from the DCT data because you're going out in the environment and just being in the environment collecting whatever speech act you're trying to find, hoping that it will occur, which could take quite a bit of time. So if you wanted to get your students to collect field notes, in addition to maybe filling out a DCT themselves and or giving a DCT to others, depending on who they have contact with, they could go out and use a table like this, which you may use actually for your own data collection if field notes becomes part of your project. And so you can see that they had categorize whether the speakers were male or female age, the hearers as well, the dominance, the social distance, if they're intimates, family members, and so on, the situation in which this is also about apologies, in which the apology occurred, the place, the time, the offense committed, and they also ranked the offenses on a scale of 1 to 3, and then, of course, wrote the apology that they found. So I mentioned there are some pros and cons to the different data collection techniques. Some of you, if you've had me in another course, have already experimented with data collection and know a little bit about this. But DCTs, or this kind of questionnaire, can be helpful in that you could get a lot of data from a particular group. You have a lot of control as the researcher, collecting this data in a limited span of time, so that's very convenient. But also, field notes and transcripts can be great sources of authentic data. It may be more complex to obtain them, but you could say more about what you find because you'll have more information, and it will be a real representation of what people say and what occurs in an interaction that's a lot more solid than what you could get with DCTs. But again, another idea is to consider the pros and cons of each of these and maybe combine these tools. So you don't have to use just one type of data collection, and we'll talk more about this in the future, but keep this in mind that you may be able to combine techniques to have a nice rich picture of whatever it is you're interested in looking at. So I mentioned we'll talk about the complements. This is the next mini analysis to collect at least 5 complements, and they can be from any environment in which you find them. It'll be interesting to see where they tend to occur. So these are some that I found. This first one is an email interaction where I wrote to an instructor because she had done a really wonderful job of allowing my students to observe her classes, and they were very happy with observations. And so I said, I have heard you are a wonderful teacher, and it is a great opportunity for observers to see an experienced instructor. And she replied by thanking me. Thank you for the nice comments. So thanking is a typical kind of response to compliments that you might notice. The next two come from TV shows that are non-scripted. They're interviews, or maybe they're semi-scripted. I don't really know how these types of interviews work when it's celebrities and a talk show host, but some of it may be pre-planned and some may be more spontaneous. But here we can see Kate Winslet and Jay Leno. Kate Winslet is an actress and Jay Leno is a host. And they've just watched a clip or shown a clip of the movie Iris. After the clip, they're talking about how this is, as Kate says, a non-makeup movie. And she says, they wouldn't even let me get my hands on an eyelash curler. And Jay Leno replies, you looked beautiful there. You have beautiful skin. So these are two very nice compliments. And then he says, what the English lack in teeth, they make up for in skin. So it's interesting, again, to consider the broader discourse-based way of looking at conversations. We can look for interesting pragmatic tokens of interesting things that occur, particular speech acts, but when you look at the surrounding discourse, you get a much more detailed picture of what's happening and the function of these particular utterances. And her response here is laughter. So that's interesting. There's light laughter. We don't have the paralinguistic information, facial expressions, for instance, but that would be something to see, to know even more. And she very gracefully then says, we did laugh about the fact that it was not a pretty film. So this is sort of a nice way of dealing with this, the nice response to this. Okay, so the last example for the complements analysis is from Conan O'Brien and Jennifer Garner, so another talk show host and another actress. And Conan O'Brien says in Alias, this is a TV show that you may or may not have heard of course airs on Sunday nights, and you're hosting Saturday Night Live this weekend with Beck. That's going to be a good show. And Jennifer Garner replies with yeah. So that's interesting. It's just sort of an acknowledgement or acceptance to the compliment, but here we have a sort of different response from the other two examples, don't we? And then he says, hey, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. So it's interesting to see where the compliments occur, who compliments whom, and what kinds of situations those are, and the responses of different types. So we'll talk more about that when you collect your examples and we meet again face to face. And as I said, I'd like for you to also think about pragmatics and other approaches to collecting and analyzing discourse. I've noted in one of the Moodle prompts where I'd like for you to talk about your final projects that you can think about critical discourse analysis, you can think about conversation analysis, pragmatics, you could look at things like gender. You might be interested in analyzing another genre like we've done in the group projects, which you all did a very nice job with. But there are lots of different options, so when you read the prompt, you'll see that I've referenced some of the readings to kind of jog your memory and to get you to think about which of those stood out as interesting for you. And then think of a context where you'd like to do a project, and we'll help you in our feedback think of a reasonable way to collect the data and analyze it, because access is an important issue. And how you could construct a nice project that's doable within the time span of the last half of the semester. And the other prompt is about pragmatics, in particular everyday contexts that we all face in our day-to-day lives. So I'm looking forward to reading your responses, and if I don't see you beforehand, have a wonderful spring break.